Top of the motherfucking morning to you, my friends. Welcome one, welcome all to my podcast, Alexandra Unfiltered, a show where we hypothesize, theorize, and analyze all about women's rights, women's wrongs, and everything in between. I am your gracious host, Alexandra Rose, a bad bee with a law degree, simply doing what I do best. Ranting, raving, whining, and complaining. And not necessarily in that order. I am here to lead you down the primrose path of patriarchal pitfalls one step at a time. I'm so excited you've joined today's episode of Alexandra Unfiltered. Before we even dive in and get started, please don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and comment. Your support of this podcast, of this endeavor, my passion project, means the world to me. And your feedback also gives me ideas for future podcast episodes and topics. So please don't forget to like and subscribe before we even get started. We are discussing a very important topic today, and I think it dovetails beautifully with the topic we discussed on last week's episode, which, as a reminder, was femicide, right? Today's topic will be discussing the forgotten feminine, human trafficking's impact on Black girls and women. Just as a forewarning, this podcast episode, the subject matter will contain perhaps what are triggering events and data statistics and facts regarding sexual assault, regarding rape, regarding intimate partner abuse and violence and trafficking. So in the event that these topics may be triggering for you, I completely understand. Please feel free to stream and or listen to a prior recorded episode of Alexandra Unfiltered. So today, we are discussing human trafficking and its specific impact on Black girls and women. As we conclude what has been a historic Black History Month, and as I conclude my discussion, or rather kind of wrap up my series on discussing how Black women and Black feminism in this country has positively impacted all movements, all civil rights and human rights and labor rights and reproductive and economic right movements throughout America's history, right? Black women and Black feminism have been at the forefront of these causes. And by that same token, Black women and girls we're learning now, are the most victimized by societal patriarchal structures, right? We've discussed how femicide primarily impacts Black women and women of color. The feminization of poverty primarily negatively impacts Black women and women of color. The period poverty experienced throughout the country and the world negatively impact primarily Black women and women of color. And unfortunately, human and sex trafficking are no different. Also a note before we dive in, I am a bad bee with a law degree, also a bad bee with a sociology and anthropology degree, so I will be presenting stats and facts and receipts, as well as concluding the episode with radical public policy solutions to this problem. Because as I have said before, over and over again, and as I will continue to repeat, anytime we see systemic institutional failures of entire groups of people, what we are seeing are intentional public policy failures by our elected officials. And thus, if public policy fails, by the same token, public policy can also succeed in eradicating and eliminating these systemic structures of oppression. As always, I have my handy dandy iPad here with the stats and facts, if you're watching here on YouTube, also for those streaming and listening on the audio podcast. And in typical Alexandra fashion, I have lost my eyeglasses and I do not have any contact lenses. So if you see me squinting to read the text on my iPad, no, you didn't, okay? No, you didn't. So diving right in today, we are discussing human trafficking's impact on Black women and girls. Human trafficking is one of the darkest, most pervasive issues facing women worldwide. It involves the use of fraud, force, or coercion to exploit individuals for labor and or commercial sex. In the US, it is estimated that there are over 100,000 minors being trafficked for sex every year, and the majority of these victims are women and girls. But what makes this even more heartbreaking is that there are so many cases that go undetected, and many of the victims are invisible within society. In fact, many victims of human trafficking are hidden in plain sight. Last month, the month of January specifically, is observed in the US as National Human Trafficking Prevention Month. As a result of this observation, it is crucial that we not just raise awareness, but we understand how trafficking operates and how we as individuals can make a difference in stopping it, and how we as individuals can also call on our lawmakers, our legislators, our officials to draft public policy to stop it. Today, in today's episode, we're not only talking about the statistics, but also the human stories behind these numbers. Stories of survival, resilience, and freedom, the fight for freedom specifically. I'd like to begin this episode with, of course, providing you an overview with some background into human trafficking. Especially on social media, we see that there are so many different definitions and explanations of human trafficking and defining human trafficking and things like that. So I think it's best to provide you with a brief sort of context or overview, or give you some background on this. So we are going to just begin by discussing how human trafficking affects women, particularly Black women and girls. Black women and girls face unique challenges due to a combination of racial, economic, and gendered oppression. Black women and girls are more vulnerable to being trafficked because of systemic inequalities that leave them marginalized and overlooked. For many, Black women and girls' experiences aren't just about being trafficked, they're also about surviving in a society that has not always protected them. In fact, society has gone out of its way to harm and oppress Black women and girls specifically. So why is human trafficking so prevalent in the modern age? Even though we have structures, allegedly, and legal mechanisms and things like that to prevent these kinds of oppressive things from happening to women and girls. Why is it so prevalent today, right? And why is it happening now more than ever before? Well, we have to understand that traffickers prey on vulnerability, whether it is financial instability, emotional trauma, or a lack of education. Vulnerabilities among groups of people make them susceptible to being harmed, and traffickers in particular are people whom I refer to as apex predators. They seek out, like heat-seeking missiles, the most vulnerable among us. And due to systemic and racial inequalities, the most vulnerable among us groups of women are Black women and girls, right? In communities where there is poverty, limited access to resources, or a lack of awareness about the dangers of trafficking, women and girls are at greater risk. And unfortunately, the internet and the dawn of social media have made this even more of an issue. Traffickers can now groom victims online, luring them with false promises of love, money, or a better life. In my day job, my day-to-day job, I am the co-founder and deputy director of a nonprofit organization that provides housing and resources to adult women who are human trafficking survivors and who are survivors of intimate partner violence. And there are so many misconceptions and myths about exactly what an adult woman victim of trafficking looks like, speaks like, and how that woman ended up becoming trafficked in the first place. The biggest myth I have observed that I am so excited to dispel and break for you today is that traffickers prey on strangers. So there's this idea that you're, walking to your car in the parking lot at the grocery store, and a trafficker or a potential kidnapper places a zip tie on your car door handle, or sprays some, liquid something or other on your car windshield in an effort to distract you. And while you're trying to correct whatever it is this person did to your car in this grocery store parking lot, a big white van pulls up full of robed, hooded men who come and snatch you off into the night, never to be seen again. And that's how you're trafficked. And Hollywood, like that movie Taken starring Liam Neeson, and other, social media trends and movements I have seen have really done us a disservice in telling us that that is exactly how human trafficking happens. And nothing could be farther from the truth. Although there are instances of women being kidnapped by strangers and then ultimately trafficked, in real life, the actual instances of that happening are almost, I think, less than 3% in total, right? More often than not, the women whom we have served through the organization I work for were trafficked from children, or from childhood rather, and they were trafficked by their own family members. They were not kidnapped by strangers and then placed on a boat to head to some foreign country overseas. They were trafficked as children by parents, by uncles, aunts, grandparents, to whomever the highest bidder was, which sometimes was a neighbor, someone they knew, another family member, a person in their church, a person at their school. And that is how the adult woman enters into being trafficked, right? She's trafficked by someone she knows. And honestly, it tracks. It makes sense, because who is in a better position to take advantage of you and your vulnerabilities than someone who knows you? Someone who knows what your vulnerabilities are, who knows what your blind spots are or what your weak spots are. Who better to do that, than a family member? And what better opportune time for that trafficker to take advantage of you than in childhood? That is more often than not, that is how and where human trafficking begins in an adult woman's life. It's in her childhood, by someone whom she knows and or is likely to be related to, right? So then you ask, okay, well, this woman, she doesn't stay a child forever. Eventually she matures into adolescence and then adulthood. Why doesn't she just walk away? Why doesn't she just move away? Especially if we live here in the United States. Well, certainly we have opportunities that women can take advantage of. Why doesn't she, at the age of 18, just leave? And I'm more than happy to explain why that doesn't happen either. Understand that trafficking is resulting in sexual violence being committed to a woman's body, to a woman's personhood. And if that sexual violence is beginning in childhood, by the time that person now advances to adolescence and then to young adulthood, that person's psyche, their mental well-being, their physical health even, is extremely compromised. They have been traumatized beyond reason, and the faculties that you and I possess as a result of not being trafficked in our childhoods are faculties that they do not possess in terms of coping mechanisms. More than that, the people who traffic them, like their family members and those closest to them, know that they will one day, those children that they're trafficking will one day become adolescents. And in an effort to keep them in the cycle of trafficking, to keep using their body as a means of making money, they begin to expose and introduce said children to drugs, to substances, addictive substances. And the goal of introducing that child or that teenager to addictive substances is to keep that child under the yoke of addiction and substance use disorder, so that said child does not have, the said child who's a teenager now, does not have the ability to just run away and break free. Because now they're addicted to substances in addition to being sexually violated on a daily basis. So this is scary, and this is much bigger than what society and the media will have you believe in terms of how trafficking happens. So now said child is an adolescent who has been sexually violated and their mental well-being is challenged, and now they are addicted to substances, not by any fault or means of their own. And additionally, as the child grows into adolescence and young adulthood, these traffickers, the people who traffic them, take greater steps to physically restrain their movement, right? So the child, it's easy to restrain their movement. You just, perhaps, they don't necessarily have to be chained up, although many are, sadly. But the child who now becomes an adolescent teenager and then becomes an adult, do you think that they just have freedom of movement to have access to, leaving wherever it is they're being trafficked at, to getting into a car, or to having access to like technology or communication methods like a cell phone or a computer? No, the trafficker deliberately removes their access to any means of movement or autonomy. So yes, they will actually literally chain them to a wall in a basement or in a room with no windows, no access to a cell phone, no access to a computer, certainly no access to the internet whatsoever, no access or connection or communication with the outside world. So you tell me exactly what you would do, chained to a wall, chained to a bed. And yes, these are real stories. This is not an exaggeration, and I'm not playing this up for the drama. These are real life stories. These are things that actually happen. So I hope this explains to you that when women are coming forward saying, I'm a victim of someone who was once trafficked, please be careful, and be careful not to just immediately dismiss their experiences as, well, why didn't you just leave? The same way that we do to women who survived intimate partner violence and abusive relationships. Well, why didn't you just leave? Why didn't you just walk away? You don't think that occurred to the person, guys? That's the first thing that occurred to them, was escaping to freedom, right? They physically cannot. Another unknown element in this scenario is that when the trafficked child becomes a teenager and then becomes a young adult, often what happens is their trafficker, whomever it is now, it doesn't always stay the same person. It starts off as a family member, then it's transferred to someone else. The trafficker will confiscate that woman's identification documents. Driver's license, identification card, passport, social security card, any document that identifies her name, date of birth, residence, anything that she may have that gives credence or credibility to who she is as a person. The trafficker confiscates those documents, because if you are escaping a situation, if you are applying for a job, what's the first thing that they usually ask for on the application? A copy of your driver's license. What's the next thing that they usually ask for? A copy of your social security card, because they have to verify your identity and confirm whether you have any existing criminal background, right? When you are applying for housing, applying for an apartment or applying for a mortgage, you have to present a copy of your driver's license. When you walk into a lawyer's office, speaking as a bad bee with a law degree, when you walk into a lawyer's office, even just for a free consultation, they'll often ask for a copy of your driver's license to attach to whatever consultation notes they gave you during that session or that meeting. So without your identification documents, without your identity, how exactly do you establish and prove to a court of law or to a social security office or to a DMV that you are who you say you are and that you are the age that you say you are? Right? If you are someone who has been trafficked or someone who's escaping a violent relationship, and you're trying to go to a police station to report what has happened to you because you're seeking the reprieve of the law, because that's what law enforcement is there to do, protect and serve, the first thing that they're going to ask you for is, do you have ID on you? May I please see your driver's license? If lacking driver's license here in the United States, do you have your US passport? Do you have your social security card? So how do I know who you are? That's the very first thing any police station will ask. And people who maybe work in law enforcement or people who work in the legal profession, such as myself, can feel free to verify what I'm saying in the comments. I'm only speaking facts. So the removal and the destruction sometimes of a woman's identification documents in conjunction with physically restraining her physical bodily movements by either keeping her chained up somewhere or keeping her locked in a room with no windows, or anytime she does leave to go somewhere, she's followed to the grocery store. She's not allowed to go to the doctor's office. She's not allowed to do anything without the trafficker or the guard or whomever it is assigned to her. Think about that. And think about that when you're saying things like, why don't they just leave? How is someone as an adult woman trafficked? How does that even happen? What do you mean you're trafficked? You couldn't just walk away? It's never that simple. The same reason why you can't walk away from that sucky job that doesn't pay you your worth and doesn't recognize your skills and pay you and promote you accordingly, because it's really just not that simple. You have bills to pay. Think of it in those terms, if that makes it easier to understand. That is how typically trafficking among people, trafficking in persons, trafficking of women, that's how it begins, and that's how it is sustained. That's how it is maintained even as that woman becomes an adult. In the organization I work for, the women's shelter that we operate, Most of the women who pass through there are adult women in like their 30s, 40s, and 50s who have been trafficked most, if not all, of their lives. Think about that. Well, why didn't they just run away? You do understand that people that runaway youth are some of the most vulnerable and susceptible to being trafficked and to being kidnapped, never to be seen again. Run away to where? With what identification documents? With what means of income to support themselves? To what, live on the street and expose themselves to further harm? To live on the street and expose themselves to further substance use disorder and drug addiction? And all manner of awful dysfunction? Do you see? So do you see how things interconnect? Systems of patriarchy, systems of violence work together in tandem to keep trafficking victims under the yoke of sexual violence. That is how these things operate. So if then trafficking primarily targets vulnerable people, and Black women and girls are some of the most vulnerable subpopulations of women, then it is not a stretch to accept that human trafficking in particular negatively impacts Black women and girls the most. And my conspiracy theory is that this recent discovery that Black women and girls are the most impacted by human trafficking is exactly why you are now seeing this influx of misinformation being spread throughout social media and the internet with, oh, trafficking happens and a woman is trafficked when she's walking to her car from the Target store and she's kidnapped by masked madmen in a big white pedophile van and never to be seen again. Because now that misinformation now takes away from the truth, right? It distracts you from the truth now. Because before, human trafficking, for a long time in the recent past, the very recent past, it was like this very hot button topic, right? It was the talk of the town. It was definitely like a popular phrase that people were using. Advocates who were previously not advocates known for speaking up for sexual violence are now speaking up about human trafficking and things like that. And then as the information and the data and the stats and the facts made it aware that Black women and girls are the most likely to be impacted by trafficking, now we're seeing misinformation being spread. And now we're seeing the conversation divert away from human trafficking. Because just like with the COVID-19 virus, the coronavirus, when Black people and brown people were were discovered to be the individuals more susceptible to dying from the COVID-19 virus, then it was, oh, we don't need all these precautions. We don't need to wear masks. We don't need vaccines. We can go back to work. All of these extra measures are unnecessary and infringe upon my constitutional rights to live as an American. When Black and brown people were the ones most likely to die from these viruses because of the same exact systemic, institutional systems of oppression. It's one big giant circle, okay? It's not even a Venn diagram, it's a giant circle. This is how Black women and girls are brought into the foray of human trafficking. And please, let's not forget here in the United States, because that's another thing too. Let's not forget that the original form of human trafficking here in the United States was labor trafficking, specifically the trafficking of African individuals who became chattel during enslavement and were enslaved by the state as property. Let's not forget that was the very first form of trafficking here in the United States. Yes, happy Black History Month indeed. So why then are Black women and girls the primary individuals so negatively impacted by human trafficking? A lot of the same reasons as to why Black women are experiencing a maternal health crisis in the US and why Black women are the ones most impacted by the feminization of poverty. Those exact same systems are the same exact systems as to why Black women and girls are the most negatively impacted by human trafficking. The impact of poverty, lack of social services, and a systemic neglect on how easily women can fall victim to trafficking all work together to oppress Black women and girls in unique ways. And it's absolutely heartbreaking because these things can be prevented. What did I say? When we see these ongoing systemic failures of entire groups of people, what we are seeing is an intentional failure of public policy. Because clock this, the United States government banned TikTok faster than they could ban the dark web and child pornography, where child trafficking and human trafficking proliferate. Clock that. They worked together to dismantle TikTok in lightning speed, bipartisan. Both sides of the aisle came to the agreement that TikTok is a Chinese spying app and it would be entirely banned, and hundreds of millions user accounts, mine included, would no longer be active. Yet and still, those same law enforcement individuals, those same elected individuals, struggle to track down child pornography websites and to eliminate them and disrupt them and put those child pornographers in jail. The dark web is still a thing, right? Where exactly do you think these trafficked children and girls and women are advertised, quote unquote? The same dark web, right? The dark web that the government still allows into existence. But the TikTok app and then like the TikTok subsidiary apps, I think the CapCut, the editing software, was also banned. We can ban that, but the dark web is still out here, so human trafficking isn't a priority. Then, trafficking of Black women and girls isn't a priority. Bringing a complete end and elimination to child pornography is not a priority. Oh, okay, noted. Clock that. Women and girls, particularly women and girls of color, face multiple barriers that make them more vulnerable to trafficking. First, there's the issue of systemic racism, which leads to fewer opportunities in education and employment. For girls in low-income neighborhoods, traffickers often pose as boyfriends or mentors, offering what seems like a way out of their tough circumstances. But it's all a trap. These girls are more likely to end up being exploited because they lack the safety nets that more privileged girls might have, and sometimes their families may not even know what's going on. I have seen in firsthand accounts, one of the women residents in our women's shelter for the organization I work for recounted how she began being trafficked as a child. Approaching, like she was a pre-adolescent. She said that she entered the life, quote unquote, as a 10 or 11-year-old, a child, a girl child, right? And she indicated that she lived in an economically depressed neighborhood. The electric current was on and off, like we're talking extremely economically depressed. And her parents were both substance use, they were drug addicts, for lack of a better phrase. They both had substance use disorder. So when she was introduced to her very first pimp, whom at the time presented himself as a boyfriend who would give her some job opportunities to help make some extra money on the side to help her family out and things like that. When she first met him now, her parents, who were in and out of the house, regularly, routinely, emotionally unavailable, mentally unavailable. She was in and out of school with, she had high degree of absence from schools, but because her parents were unreachable due to their drug addiction, the truant officer coming to the house didn't really do anything. When she met her first pimp then, it was easy for said pimp to manipulate her and groom her because she did not have any safeguards in her environment to protect her from the wayward advances of this creepy man, this creepy grown-ass adult man preying on a literal child, right? Her parents were absent. They were asleep at the switch, for lack of a better word. She was the oldest sibling, so she didn't have any older siblings, like a mean big sister or something, which I am, to try to protect her or talk sense into her. Because she was so frequently absent from school due to her parents' neglect, she didn't have teachers or counselors or anyone who could step in the gap for her to protect her. She was completely left vulnerable and alone. So being left exposed like that as a literal child now, yeah, traffickers see that as prime opportunity. These folks are apex predators, right? So that lack of social safety systems for herself and her family, living in an economically depressed neighborhood, living in a food desert, going to an underfunded public school. It's like, it's so easy for them, is what she told us when she was describing her life story to us. It's so easy for these traffickers to come right in and say, it's okay, baby, I have just the thing. I'm going to bring you out. I have just the thing you need. I have a job opportunity, right? And they don't come in with the horns and the pitchfork, you know what I mean? With the little devilish tail swinging back and forth, you know, preaching hellstone and brimstone and fire and things like that. They don't come looking like Satan. They come looking like the answer to every little girl's prayers or dreams in these cases of human trafficking. They first, you know, charm or groom the young girl with free gifts, lavish gifts. They might give her a cell phone or a nice piece of jewelry. They may take her out to somewhere to eat if she's not accustomed to eating regularly and normally because her diet is poor due to, again, those same systemic issues we discussed before. So she's groomed into thinking, oh, this person is good. This person is safe. They want the best for me. They want to do nice things for me. And that's how it starts. Yeah, so these things happen, yes. And now we are in our segment where I'm going to discuss some stats and facts about human trafficking. And I'm going to look at some global statistics with respect to human trafficking. So worldwide, it is estimated there are over 40 million people victims of human trafficking globally, according to the International Labor Organization and the Walk Free Foundation. This statistic includes victims of forced labor, victims of sexual exploitation, and other forms of trafficking, including but not limited to labor trafficking as well. Women and girls represent a shocking 71% of trafficking victims globally, with a disproportionate number of victims trafficked for sexual exploitation, according to the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. Approximately 4.8 million people are trafficked for sexual exploitation around the world. And that's also according to the International Labor Organization and the Walk Free Foundation. An estimated 24.9 million people are in forced labor, with many working in industries such as agriculture, construction, and domestic work. And that is also according to the International Labor Organization. I would like to take a moment to pause and remind you that these statistics are based on reported facts and figures. So as we know with crimes specifically relating to sexual violence, the only information we have is what victims are ready and willing to come forward with. So essentially, this is just the tip of the iceberg, because the unreported sexual exploitation and sexual human trafficking and labor trafficking numbers are estimated to be in the hundreds of millions. And it makes sense that an estimated almost 25 million people are in forced labor in industries like agriculture and construction and domestic work. Here in the United States, we have a madman, a sentient Dorito, wearing a badly formed toupee in our White House right now, trying to initiate policy that would result in the mass deportation of individuals of Latin and African and Caribbean descent, individuals who work primarily in agriculture and construction. Those agricultural places and those construction sites sometimes are breeding grounds for where trafficking can and does take place, where it initiates. Because those individuals, undocumented individuals or individuals who are here in the United States and have challenges related to their documentation, to their immigration status and whatnot, they're prime fodder for a trafficker. Seriously, yes. All of those people are prime fodders for either, they're in labor trafficking, they're being trafficked by their employers because they're being paid pennies per day for the work that they perform, right? And they don't have any choice. Again, no identification documents. They have no recourse to go to a court of law or to a police station, right? They don't speak English very well. Boom, language barrier. And they're impoverished. So even though they're only being paid pennies a day, at least the pennies can buy them a drink of water as opposed to not having anything at all, right? These systems, economic systems, these legal systems All of these systems work together to traffic individuals. And yes, Black women and girls are the most likely ones to be trafficked, right? With respect to child trafficking, 1 in 4 trafficking victims globally are children. And that's estimated according to the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, and that was as of 2020. The Asia Pacific region is home to the highest number of trafficking victims, with 2/3 of all global trafficking victims living in this area alone, according to the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime as of 2020. So where Black women and girls here in the United States are most likely to be trafficked, women and girls throughout the world most likely to be trafficked come from that Asia Pacific region. So East Asia, South Asia, countries like Japan and China, Thailand and Myanmar, India, so on and so forth, the countries in that part of the world, right? So again, minority girls and women, right? Remember when I talked about Black feminism and its impact on American history in the United States? And we discussed how a lot of movements led by white feminists have some very glaring blind spots that don't adequately address or acknowledge the unique challenges faced by Black women and women of color. This is what I talk about. This is what I mean. Remember when I said that no matter how good life is for a white woman, I, as a Black woman in my skin, with my ethnicity and my background, still have to worry about police brutality, and still have to worry about maternal health crises, and still have to worry about human trafficking? This is what we mean when we say that these white feminist movements contain glaring blind spots. And so we have to come up with our own feminist movements as Black women and as women of color. Clock it. Now moving to some stats and facts of human trafficking here in the United States specifically. In the United States, there are an estimated over 400,000 victims of human trafficking every year, according to the National Human Trafficking Hotline. According to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, it is estimated that over 100,000 minors are at risk of trafficking for sex each and every year in the United States. Women and girls account for a whopping 71% of trafficking victims in the US, and specifically, African American and Latina women are disproportionately affected by human trafficking in the US, often facing higher vulnerability due to systemic racial inequalities and socioeconomic factors. And that is according to the National Human Trafficking Hotline as of the year 2020. There are certain methods and methodology that these traffickers, whom I refer to as apex predators, use when attempting to traffic a girl or a woman. These methods include manipulation, coercion, and force, the threat of physical violence and physical violence itself to control victims. Social media and online platforms are increasingly used to recruit and further exploit women and children for sex trafficking. And that is according to data from the Polaris Project as of 2020. Pausing for a second to briefly touch on the social media aspect. We really take for granted as women living here in the US, living in the imperial core, just how much social media is used abroad by traffickers to recruit women and girls. And how they will do it is they'll create a social media post on a particular platform, say for example, Instagram or Facebook, indicating that there is a job opportunity in the next town over that requires some travel, but there is a paid job opportunity that will include lodging or housing. And if you contact so-and-so, they will give you the information on the opportunity, and they'll also pay for your transportation or your flight or your travel expenses to get to said job opportunity. The woman's family or the girl's family will think, oh, this is a legitimate opportunity, or it's a legitimate educational opportunity to go to school or university, and will travel to the place where the job allegedly is, arrive, and immediately have their identification documents confiscated and or destroyed by the trafficker, and immediately be restrained or bound in the place where they said the job opportunity was. They'll have their cell phone, all communication and contact devices removed from them and destroyed, their computer, their identification documents, everything. And then boom, now they're being trafficked. That's how social media is used, FYI, when we say these things. And that's just one example, by the way. I could go into so much more. Honestly, this could be a 2-part episode, but I will be very candid with you. I don't know if I have it in me to discuss something like this once again so soon. You see what I mean? Because this is a very heavy topic. But, I have to remind myself, this is not a time to be fearful. This is a time to be fearless. Okay? Clock it. So the National Human Trafficking Hotline received more than 22,000 reports of potential trafficking cases in 2019 alone, involving more than 10,000 individual victims. In that same year, there were 1,864 arrests for human trafficking related offenses in the United States. And that is according to both the Polaris Project and the United States Federal Bureau for Investigation, aka the FBI. Again, pausing to touch on the arrest and things like that. One specific line of feedback that I often hear from the public with respect to human trafficking and respect to prosecution is, well, why then doesn't our law enforcement or our criminal justice system have methods in place for arresting, charging, and convicting traffickers, right? Why don't we see more of them experiencing being jailed and taken off the streets, right? And there's a very good answer for that. I think one of the sole acts that exists in the United States, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of, I believe, 2000 or 2001, aka something very recent. The requirements for someone to be convicted under that act as a trafficker are extremely high. The standard that a prosecutor has to meet for someone to specifically be convicted of trafficking, not just of a sex crime, but of human trafficking specifically, are extremely high. And one of those requirements is that you must have a complaining witness who is willing to testify. Now, what do we know about victimology? Individuals who have recently escaped a violent situation, whether it's a relationship, a domestic situation, or a trafficking situation, are they typically ready to sit in a big, intimidating, scary court of law before strangers, before armed police officers, before a judge in black robes on a bench, and strangers sitting in a jury pool with an antagonistic defense attorney cross-examining them? Are they ready to sit there and testify to their decades potentially of trauma and violence and abuse? And that testimony is required for someone to be convicted of trafficking? Your next question will be, well, Alex, duh, wouldn't that be a required act for any person to be criminalized or to be criminalized? Isn't that something that is constitutional, to protect a defendant's right to confront their witness? And to that I say, do you know how many criminal acts do not require a complaining witness to testify in order for the defendant to still be convicted and tried? Drug crimes, anyone? Do drug crimes require a complaining witness who's willing to testify? Right? Do a lot of these other crimes where you see people getting locked up and thrown in jail and then the keys also thrown away to the jail and all that stuff like that? Like 9 times out of 10, those crimes do not require a complaining witness who is required to testify. I promise you that. Otherwise, the prosecutor wouldn't be successful in levying charges and a conviction against a criminal defendant. So keep that in mind, okay? That's what organizations like mine advocate for, is that the Trafficking Victims Protection Act be revised to remove the requirement of a complaining witness who's willing to testify, and instead fall in line with other criminal acts that can still successfully achieve convictions based on evidence alone and with no complaining witness needed. Because, as we argue and as legal advocates like myself argue, like how other crimes are crimes because they're crimes against the state, they're crimes against the people, is the same way that trafficking should be classified. It's a crime against the state. It's a crime against the entity of the people. And as a result, you do not need a complaining witness who's willing to testify. It would be nice for the prosecutor's case. It would be a little flower, a little nice added touch, to, a little garnish to finish off and top off this wonderful trial or what have you, but it should not be required, because that requirement deters trafficking victims from seeking criminal charges against their trafficker. Because we have to also think about traffickers are apex predators who are violent and could have people retaliate against said victim, right? That's why we struggle to have victims in like drug cases when we're talking about organized crime and things like that. Retaliation is a very real threat for women victims of trafficking. So making it a requirement that the woman bears, the victim bears the burden of proof of their victimhood, rather than the state bearing the burden of proof, as it is in in every single criminal and civil proceeding, where the state is the litigant or the prosecutor or the person bringing the charge. I don't know what to say. I don't know what to say. And thus far, elected officials and things like that, and people like them, are very slow to be receptive to this advocacy, because I'm not the first person to advocate for this particular revision to the Trafficking Victims Act, right? I'm not the first person to advocate for it, but the response from law enforcement is, well, it's a he said, she said sometimes, and without the complaining witness, the facts are murky, and we need people to point fingers at people in court, because without that, the evidence is always lacking. The evidence can point to the fact that the woman actually wanted to be in this situation, because we have social media messages and DMs and texts that show that she was. So we need her complaining witness status, to prove that she was actually trafficked, because the evidence alone isn't strong enough. These same Keystone fucking cops who shoot and kill unarmed black people because they assume unarmed black people are inherently criminals, and then who get away with it, turn around and tell us, legal advocates in these spaces, that evidence isn't sufficient. So what fucking evidence then is needed when George Floyd was knelt on and slowly suffocated to death? What evidence was needed then? What evidence did the cop or the police officer, who was an agent of the state, what evidence did he need to do that? Wearing his uniform and his badge and the gun on his hip and the authority, the constitutional authority of the United States on his back. What evidence did he need for that? What evidence did the cop need when he pulled over Sandra Bland and then killed her and then she died and never to be seen again? What evidence did they need? Did the state require a complaining witness then? Did the state need the cop to complain as a witness and then go testify as well? Oh, clock that. Clock it. Clock that T. Okay? The states in the United States that report the highest rates of human trafficking include California, Texas, Florida, and New York, with many incidents occurring in major urban areas. These regions also see a high number of cases involving labor trafficking as well, and that is according to the Polaris Project and, the National Human Trafficking Hotline. So those states, California, Texas, Florida, and New York, what do those states have in common? They are states that have high numbers of immigrant communities and communities of foreigners and brown people and minorities. California, Texas, Florida, and New York. Those California, Texas, and Florida in particular have strong agricultural economies that require unique agricultural labor on farms and things like that for people who harvest and basically pick the food that we consume and that we purchase from grocery stores. That's not coincidence. When I was on a human trafficking task force here in the city of Detroit, where we had to partner with the Detroit Police Department, I learned that an unassumed, unspoken hub of human trafficking in the Midwest is actually Southeast Michigan and Ohio. Like random ass Ohio and Southeast Michigan. Why? Because Michigan and Ohio are states that border the country of Canada, and specifically Southeast Michigan, the city of Detroit, borders the entry point to Windsor, Canada, which is a major urban industrial area within Canada. Additionally, many interstate freeways and highways that traverse throughout the United States have their beginning and ending points here in Detroit, one of them being I-75, a freeway that runs north to south. I-75, for those who are familiar, runs like all the way from Florida up here to Michigan, all the way up to northern Michigan. So the confluence of freeways and highways and expressways act as a mechanism for trafficking victims to be transported both here in the United States and from the United States to Canada. Clock that. Additionally, the COVID-19 pandemic exacerbated vulnerabilities, with reports suggesting an increase in online exploitation and trafficking, as well as greater difficulty for victims to access help or escape from traffickers. And that is according to data from the Polaris Project. So we've reviewed stats and facts. We have done an overview. We have provided background and context for how human trafficking starts, what it looks like, how it begins, and how extremely difficult it is for a trafficking victim, a woman especially, a Black woman or a Black girl especially, to escape the clutches of a trafficker and the trafficker's overarching organization, because these things happen in clusters and groups, okay? Organized crime is alive and well. Do not be misled or confused, right? So then what are some of the solutions that we can implement to correct this systemic social ill, right? Human trafficking, although a global crisis that affects millions of people, has a disproportionate impact on Black women and girls. In particular, in the US, human trafficking is both a sex trafficking and labor trafficking issue, with a particular focus on women of color, right? So what can we do to support organizations on the ground that are directly helping survivors of human trafficking? Well, there are countless groups that provide shelter, counseling, legal support, and resources for survivors. And those groups need our help. For example, the organization I work for, the Exodus Foundation, is an organization I co-founded, and it's a woman-led Detroit-based nonprofit that is doing incredible work to help survivors of trafficking get back on their feet. We provide everything from job training and housing to emotional and psychological support, as well as legal support and assisting trafficking victims in reconstructing their identity, right? So taking them to the Secretary of State and the DMV and helping them gather and collect and reestablish their driver's license and social security cards and things like that, right? And we help women regain their sense of dignity and agency and security, because our intention is a permanent removal from trafficking and from violence, an exodus from these systems, right? You can help by supporting local organizations that fight human trafficking, whether through donations or volunteer work, and staying informed. Knowledge is absolutely power. I am not the only person in this space having these discussions and trying to kind of spread this information and this awareness. There are other women like me, and even other men too in these spaces, who, like me, we struggle to gain traction on our podcast and on our YouTube channels and things like that, when all we're seeking to do is educate and make people aware of these things, while also making our lawmakers aware of these challenges and laying the responsibility for correcting these challenges at our lawmakers' feet. So you can follow news stories, read reports, and share information you learn with others. Awareness is absolutely the first step in breaking the cycle. Another critical way to make a difference is getting involved in advocacy. Reaching out to your local and state lawmakers to support policies that protect victims and work toward the prevention of human trafficking. We can make sure that those who profit from exploiting women and girls face the consequences they deserve. As we wrap up today's episode, I want to leave you with a call to action, okay? January was National Human Trafficking Prevention Month. February is Black History Month, and coming up in March will be Women's History Month. These issues are not things that we should only think about for 28 to 31 days per year, especially with human trafficking. Human trafficking is a year-round global crisis that requires our constant attention. Whether it is donating to shelters, volunteering your time, or educating yourself and others, we can all do our part to combat this issue and support women who are vulnerable to exploitation. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Alexandra Unfiltered. If you found today's conversation particularly enlightening or informative, I encourage you to like this episode, to subscribe to my podcast streams and to my YouTube channel, and to share this information and this episode among your own social networks, okay? Knowledge is power, and although we are facing unprecedented times and periods of an explosion of sexual violence and gendered violence upon our personhood as women, we have to remind ourselves that now is not the time to be fearful. Rather, now is the time to be fearless. This is an important inflection point in our country's history, our nation's history, and our history as women. The women who come after us, our descendants, or the people whom, even if they're not our direct relatives or descendants, the women who come after us in the future will study and look to what we did and said here in this vital, crucial moment, and will want to know, did we fight for them? Did we stick ourselves out for them? Did we stick out our necks for them and put ourselves on the line for them? Did we try to stop this violence? Did we try to do anything or try to take any overt concerted steps or actions to minimize, if not altogether eliminate, this gendered violence? They will want to know that. They will want to ask these questions the same way that we ask our foremothers and the women, the powerful, brave, incredible women who came before us. We study what they did now to inform us how to move forward, right? So our descendants and the people who come after us will look to us and ask, well, what did you do in this crucial time? Did you sit back and throw your hands up and say, that's not my problem, not my clowns, not my circus? Or did you stand and fight? I want to leave you with that, all right? Did you stand and fight? Thank you so much for listening to Alexandra Unfiltered. Until next time.